Thank you, Ari, for that very generous introduction. I actually had no idea that I was supposed to be so famous. It is a very great honor to be invited to give the Weizmann lecture. And I would like to begin by thanking Yoram Shamir for the caricatures that he has provided. Is he here this evening? Let me just run through them very quickly. You can see, I think most of these are very self-explanatory. And I begin with a quote. Like Samson, bringing down the temple over his head to destroy the assembled Philistines, according to a critic at the time, so Mr. Bevin, in his determination to destroy Zionism, made Britain's Palestine policy collapse into ruins. The physical symbol of this failure became clear with the building of barbed wire fences in February 1947, about halfway from the end of the Second World War in 1945 to the time of Israel's independence in 1948. More precisely, it was the time when Britain handed over the Palestine issue to the United Nations. The barbed wire enclaves were called Bevingrads, now sealing off British defense zones. One of the zones was in the central part of Jerusalem, including the Anglo-Palestine Bank building and the Central Post Office. The police conducted body searches of those wanting to enter the fenced areas. The British Army remained, of course, an efficient fighting force, but the Bevingrads, in fact, became internment camps for British soldiers and policemen who were permitted to leave only when on duty. Ironically, the British were now themselves prisoners in the mandated territory they had ruled since the First World War. Now, my question is, how can the era of the Labour government be reassessed to judge the extent to which Ernest Bevin himself can be held responsible? For that matter, the extent to which any one individual can be held accountable from both the British and Zionist perspectives for such a complex British catastrophe as the end of the Palestine Mandate. Now, let there be no mistake about it. The policy of the Labour government was the policy of Ernest Bevin. How did the Zionists gradually shape a considered view of him, and what was the reaction of his colleagues in the British government to him at the time, and what was the way in which he was regarded in the wider circles of Parliament and the British public? Now, as a chapter in the end of the, As a chapter in the end of the British Empire, how do the police and military units, especially the special or paramilitary forces, anti-terrorist squads, lead to a conclusion on the use of force and torture, and what view did Ernest Bevin take of these secret methods used to combat the terrorists in Palestine? And to ask the final direct question, was Bevin an anti-Semite, ranking only a slot or so below Adolf Hitler? What was Bevin's ultimate aim? And here I take account not only of the Zionist assessments at the time, but also of Bevin's critics in England, of whom Richard Crossman was foremost. Crossman was the leading British Zionist, famous as a backbencher of the Labour Party, later as leader of the House of Commons, and subsequently as editor of the New Statesman. He is remembered today mainly for his published Diaries of a Cabinet Minister, which revealed the inner workings of the British government. During the Second World War, Crossman had served in the Allied Expeditionary Force and was one of the first British officers to enter the Dachau concentration camp in the spring of 1945. Later that same year, Ernest Bevin nominated him as a member of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry on Palestine. Subsequently, Bevin never forgave Crossman for the stab in the back, Bevin's own phrase, betraying not only Bevin himself, but also the Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. Crossman became known as the man who stabbed Ernie Bevin in the back. So Crossman is thus of central importance. It's of paramount interest that he later wrote of Attlee and Bevin. Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin plotted to destroy the Jews in Palestine and then encourage the Arabs to murder the lot. I fought them at the time as murderers who intended genocide. So Crossman wrote only a half dozen years after the creation of the Jewish state, and this is a point to which I shall return. During the early part of the Second World War, in January 1941, Chaim Weizmann and others believed that Bevin had an open mind and was favorably disposed towards the Jewish cause. Bevin was then Minister of Labor. In London, the minutes of a meeting of the Jewish Agency record Weizmann as saying that Mr. Bevin has a great belief, who is open-minded and energetic. Yet a few weeks later, Bevin had acquired a more guarded attitude. He said that personally, he would like to see the Jewish people firmly established in Palestine, but he now seems to be preoccupied with another important factor in the situation, the Arab factor. In view of the German danger to Egypt as well as Britain in 1941, the British, in Bevin's own words, I quote, could not afford to do anything which might make our relations with the Arab countries more difficult. Now, no one in the early part of the war would have guessed that Ernest Bevin would become Foreign Secretary in 1945, or that he would be remembered in England as a powerful political personality comparable to Lords Castlereagh, Palmerston, Salisbury, and Sir Edward Grey. No one during the war could have predicted Bevin's part in the Palestine controversy. Yet as prelude, the wartime conversations are of interest, not only because of the indication of Bevin's future thought, but also because there is evidence that the Zionist leaders were already aware of Harold Bealey, later to become Bevin's right-hand man. Bealey, during the war, worked at Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, under Arnold Toynbee, who was himself a significant anti-Zionist. He once wrote that A.J. Balfour was an evil man. Harold Bealey was known already to have an anti-Zionist reputation, but those on the executive committee of the Jewish Agency in London debated whether it would be useful to make contact with him or run the risk of antagonizing him further. Again, no one would have supposed that Harold Bealey would eventually play such a prominent part in Palestine's future. In the view of some Zionists, a diabolical part. There were two sets of demonologies. One was the Zionist, in which Ernest Bevin came to rank only slightly below Hitler, and the other, the British demonology, in which, from Bevin's own vantage point, the diabolical work had been done by A.J. Balfour in 1917. Bevin is on record as saying that the Balfour Declaration was the greatest mistake in Britain's imperial history. Whenever it came up in conversation with Zionists, he would dismiss it simply as a power politic statement made to rally Jews in Europe and America to help Britain at a critical time during the war. He probably underestimated the commitment by Balfour and others at the time to the Jewish cause, but he certainly would have been aware of the steadfast dedication of Balfour's niece, Blanche Baffy Dugdale, who served on the Jewish Executive Committee up to the time of the very founding of the Jewish state and her death in May 1948. And I will take the liberty of referring to her as Baffy. As Balfour's niece, she symbolically represented the cause, and as an aristocrat moving in high circles, had contact with key politicians. Now, under the leadership of Weizmann, Baffy Dugdale worked with Louis Namier, the historian, Ivor Linton, who later became an Israeli diplomat, and others in the headquarters of the Jewish Executive Committee in Great Russell Street, not far from the British Museum. Baffy was not only Balfour's niece, but also his biographer. She is of interest, moreover, because of her extensive friendships, anti-Zionist as well as Zionist, including, for example, Walter Elliott, the Secretary of State for Scotland before the Second World War, who confided to Baffy secrets of the British government at the highest level. Other friends included Sir Reginald Coupland, the professor of history of British Empire and Commonwealth at Oxford University, and Baffy herself was always part of Weizmann's inner circle. She was moreover significant in the sense that she had a lasting friendship with David Ben Gurion, despite the friction and his later break with Weizmann. With Ben Gurion, Baffy shared a lasting interest in classical Greek literature, especially Plato. She believed that statesmanship on the model of her uncle was essential for a unified movement for a Jewish state. She thus despaired of the factions, disagreements, and open controversies among Zionists in England, America, and Palestine. She believed that only Weizmann's intelligence and foresight could prove effective against Ernest Bevin, whom she held in warm contempt, but recognized his authority and persistence in trying to block Zionist aims in Palestine. The cumulative historical knowledge of the members of the Jewish Executive Committee in London and their friends more than matched that of the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office, in part because Reginald Coupland had been the mastermind of the report by the 1937 Royal Commission on Palestine, which recommended partition. The breadth of Coupland's cultural and religious as well as historical knowledge was clear on every page of the report. The other historical document on which everyone focused attention was, of course, the famous or infamous White Paper of 1939, which severely limited Jewish immigration to Palestine at the time of their greatest need, while proposing an Arab Jewish state in which the Jews would always be a minority. The White Paper acquired notoriety, among other reasons, because of Ben Gurion's famous exclamation, "We shall fight the war as if there was no White Paper, and the White Paper as if there was no war." Yet whenever the White Paper was mentioned in Zionist discussions with Ernest Bevin, he would simply dismiss it, invariably saying that he wanted to find a solution to the problems post-1945, not 1939. Bevin himself was the architect of Britain's post-war Palestine policy. He dominated the cabinet of the Labour government. The power of his intellect, as well as his domineering manner, was well conveyed by Roy Jenkins when he wrote that the Prime Minister, usually a stern taskmaster, allowed Bevin to have his way in cabinet discussions while denying the privilege to everyone else. On one occasion, when the drift of discussion seemed to be going in the opposite direction from his own views, Bevin interrupted and said, "That won't do, Prime Minister. It don't fit in with my policy." Roy Jenkins went on to describe how Bevin stopped the engine in its tracks, lifted it up, and put it back facing the other direction. No one else could have done it. The core of his thought on Palestine was that the solution to the problems arising from the Holocaust should be resolved by reintegrating the Jews into European society rather than encouraging mass immigration into Palestine. And in the post-Holocaust circumstances of 1945, such a view from the Jewish perspective was unspeakable. There was thus from the outset two virtually irreconcilable positions. Winston Churchill referred to Bevin as a working-class John Bull. As patriots, the two shared common characteristics. Churchill was a Zionist, though his commitment varied. He was well disposed towards Weizmann, and during the war set up a highly secret committee to further the Zionist cause. But towards the end of the war, everything changed. One of Churchill's intimate friends was Lord Moyne, who held the position of minister resident in the Middle East. In November 1944, he was assassinated by the Jewish military group known to the British as the Stern Gang. Churchill's attitude towards a possible Jewish state changed immediately. He became less than lukewarm in support of the Zionist cause. To Weizmann, the assassination of Lord Moyne was a catastrophe. Churchill had lent invaluable support. Churchill himself now became more critical of Bevin, deploring the loss of British, what Churchill called blood and treasure, just as Bevin became emotionally distraught when speaking of the British working-class soldiers in Palestine. I quote, "I cannot bear English Tommies being killed. The Tommies, they belong to my class. They are my people." Now, Bevin was at first confident that he could resolve the Palestine problem, indeed making the extravagant statement that he would pin his career on it. He acquiesced in the American proposal for a committee of inquiry in the belief that it would conclude that Palestine was essentially an Arab country, one in which Jews and Arabs could eventually live in harmony, though with the Jews as a permanent minority. There would be Jewish and Arab provinces in a federal structure. Instead, the committee, the Anglo-American Committee, not only recommended partition, but also the immediate admission of 100,000 Jews, as President Harry S. Truman had already proposed. Bevin and Attlee believe that Crossman, as a member of the committee, had played a critical part in tilting it towards a solution at absolute variance with British interests in the Middle East. Bevin's general aim, as distinct from his ideas about Palestine, was to develop the Middle East and Africa in order for Britain to remain one of the big three of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain. With the support of the Arab states, the Middle East would replace India as Britain's source of strength, especially in oil. Britain could fend off the danger of the United States, reducing Britain to the status of a vassal state. American economic assistance was vital in post-war recovery, but on this point, there was no love lost between Bevin and the United States. To achieve his aims, the British would have to do no less than reconstruct the British Empire on the basis of equal partnership between the British and the Arabs. Palestine was the stumbling block for Bevin. It led him to say to Weizmann that if the Jews wanted to fight, they could have one. At another time, he uttered his unfortunate phrase about the Jews wanting to get to the head of the queue for assistance. In another controversial statement, in his first major speech in Parliament on Palestine, Weizmann, in response, said that it was, I quote, brutal, vulgar, and anti-Semitic. And on the famous remark on the Jews wanting to get to the head of the queue, Weizmann parried with a comment that was emotionally moving. Jews had held high priority in the queues leading to the crematoria of Auschwitz and Treblinka. By the autumn and fall of 1945, the first stage of Zionist demonology had crystallized, yet there was still considerable speculation about Bevin's personality and his general ideas about Palestine. The Zionists believed him to be ignorant, incoherent, and perhaps captive of what was called the Foreign Office Gestapo. Apart from the diabolical description of the Foreign Office, the perception of Bevin as illiterate and confused was a misconception. With his working class background, Bevin was certainly not as articulate as the leaders of the Zionist movement or the Foreign Office officials who had gone to Oxford and Cambridge. Yet Bevin not only mastered his briefs, he also had his own independent and original ideas. He once commented, without bragging, but simply making a point, that he was a turn-up in a million. But it did not prevent him from making errors of judgment. One was his statement that he knew the reason President Truman was insisting on the admission of 100,000 Jews to Palestine. It was because, Bevin said, there were already too many Jews in New York. There was an element of black humor and bursts of anger. And I should mention that Bevin, at this stage of his life, had the condition of a sick man with heart trouble, high blood pressure, blacking out on at least 2 occasions. His problems of health made him irritable and impatient, and to some, intolerable, especially in his outbursts against the Jews. His health does not excuse his diatribes, but helps to explain them. Palestine was not one of Bevin's priorities, nor did he want it to be. But in July 1946, he faced the blowing up of the King David Hotel. From the British vantage point, it was a major act of terrorism, though, of course, one man's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. Chaim Weizmann responded immediately by saying that the explosion at the hotel represented a catastrophe and would have incalculable effects on the British military and civilian administration in Palestine, as well as on the government in London. And he was certainly right. Almost immediately, General Evelyn Barker, the officer commanding in Palestine, declared that British troops must have no social relations with the Jewish community, and in a famous comment said that we will be punishing the Jews in a way the race dislikes as much as any, by striking at their pockets and showing our contempt of them. On the Zionist side, Weizmann, for one, believed that the King David explosion signified the movement for a Jewish state was now spiraling into, I quote, violence and gangsterism. In December 1946, Weizmann was replaced by David Ben Gurion, a development regarded by the British as carrying with it yet more activism and probable terrorism. Bevin was already thinking that a solution might be found at the United Nations. The rationale was that the moral and political authority of the United Nations would strengthen the British position, assuming that the majority of the 57 members would recognize that Palestine was essentially an Arab country and that any lasting solution would have to be acceptable to the Arabs themselves. In February 1947, the same month as the building of the barbed wire Bevin grads, Bevin announced in Parliament that Britain would now look to the United Nations. Curiously enough, both the British and the Zionists were optimistic. Harold Bealey calculated that the Arab states would support a proposal for a strengthened British trusteeship regime, and with it, the plan for a binational federal state. Weizmann, with reduced institutional authority but still with immense influence, believed that the Zionist cause at the United Nations might emerge triumphant. One development seemed especially encouraging. Sumner Welles, who had served as Roosevelt's Undersecretary of State until 1942, volunteered to help. He had long experience in Latin America, and Welles knew personally many of the ambassadors to the United Nations. The mobilizing of the Latin American delegates in late 1947 was one of the essential reasons why the vote went in favor of partition. And this, too, is a point to which I will return. Bevin was flummoxed. At this point, he further anticipated that it might be time actually to withdraw, though he was keeping a close eye on the military police situation in Palestine, and he had not quite yet abandoned hope. February 1947 was thus the point of climax at this stage of the Palestine issue. Bevin had to take decisions against the background of the great emotional debate about India, the collapse of the new defense arrangement with Egypt, a sense of impending economic disaster, and in Britain itself, one of the worst winters in British history. At one point during a meeting with a Zionist delegation, the lights of the Foreign Office went out. But Bevin said not to worry, we have the Israel lights with us. Bevin argued the case relentlessly in the discussions of the cabinet. He emphasized the repercussions of partition on the Arab states. The loss of Arab goodwill would mean the elimination of British influence in the Middle East to the advantage of Russia, which in turn would weaken the position of Britain and the British Commonwealth in the world. There was also the dimension of the United Nations itself, where a showdown could not be avoided because of the indeterminate status of the mandate in international law. Bevin, most particularly Harold Bealey, who prepared the detailed case, did not want to be held responsible in Arab eyes for a policy of partition. By taking the question to the United Nations, the British would appear to assume an impartial position, but in fact they would allow the pro-Arab majority of the General Assembly to decide the issue for them, that is to say, in favor of the British. As late as February 1947, despite renewed outbreaks of terrorism and virtual civil war, Bevin considered but rejected, with a ring of self-confidence, the possibility of evacuation. He did not wish to leave the Arabs, the Jews, the Americans, and the United Nations, in his words, stewing in their own juices. The British would not go to the United Nations to surrender the mandate. Against the background of a rising danger of anti-Jewish sentiment in England because of terrorist attacks against British troops in Palestine, and increasingly virulent anti-British sentiment in New York, the tension between the British and the Zionists reached new heights. In July 1947, the Irgun hanged 2 British sergeants and placed booby traps on their bodies. They became British martyrs. Bevin told the American Secretary of State, General George Marshall, that the executions would never be forgotten, and that, I quote, anti-Jewish feeling in England now was greater than it had been in 100 years. There was some truth in this in view of the anti-Jewish riots in Liverpool and elsewhere. The Zionists also had symbolic figures, and they appealed to a much greater public conscience. In the same month, July 1947, British authorities turned away some 4,500 Jewish refugees aboard the Exodus, and in one of his black rages, Bevin decided, I quote, to teach the Jews a lesson. The passengers aboard the Exodus would be returned to their port of embarkation in France. As it transpired, the Jews refused to disembark. Bevin, now blundering from one position to another, wound up sending the survivors of the Nazi murder camps back to Germany. When the members of the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, INSCOP, visited Palestine in the summer of 1947, they found the British community in a state of siege. Wives and children had been evacuated. The number of British police and military forces, together with the contingents of the Arab Legion, now rivaled the symbolic figure of 100,000 Jewish refugees who were still interned in European displaced person camps. The United Nations, at this point, observed that the Bevin grads, where British personnel were bivouacked behind barbed wire, 1/10 of the armed forces of the entire British Empire now occupied a territory the size of Wales. There was one soldier for every 18 inhabitants in the country, or as one observer calculated, one for every city block. The drain on the economy for military upkeep alone amounted close to £40 million a year to an England still on wartime rations. Churchill stated in Parliament, "There is the manpower of at least 100,000 men in Palestine who might well be at home, strengthening our depleted industry. What are they doing there? What good are we getting out of it?" These were questions that he asked directly to Ernest Bevin. When Britain moved into severe economic crisis in 1947, a broad consensus of public, parliamentary, and cabinet opinion held that military withdrawal was an economic as well as a political and ethical imperative. The general crystallization of British sentiment in favor of withdrawal did not necessarily contradict the Foreign Office's hopes, Harold Beeley's in particular, of preserving Britain's political and strategic position by relying on the probable action by the United Nations. This was a rational and indeed ingenious calculation, as the Zionists at the time recognized. It was based on the assumption that even biased or obtuse observers would not endorse partition because the creation of a Jewish state would precipitate full-scale civil war, indeed an international war. Bevin also assumed the Soviet Union and the United States on this issue and others would gravitate into opposite camps. He hoped, in short, that the United Nations would support an independent binational state in which Jewish rights would be guaranteed and the promise of a national home more or less fulfilled. As it turned out, the British merely confirmed that the United Nations did not operate on British rational assumptions. The struggle for the Jewish state, as Bevin was beginning to discover, was fueled not only by a sense of historical necessity deriving immediately from the Holocaust, but also from genuine humanitarian sentiment, as well as worldwide animosity against British imperialism. Anti-colonialism, as it has been traditionally understood, was a conspicuous force in the summer and autumn of 1947. The opportunity to disrupt the British Empire in the Middle East certainly helps to explain Russian motivation. All of these developments triggered the British decision in September 1947 to evacuate. As background to the decision, in England, a certain current of public protest was guided by Richard Crossman, who was then assistant editor of the New Statesman as well as member of Parliament, and who expressed revulsion against suppressing a people who had suffered unspeakable atrocities under the Nazis. All this was occurring at a time when the British feared the impending collapse of their economy. Decisions on Palestine were being made during a time of underlying economic anxiety, which provides a key to the mood of September 1947. By then, even Bevin had concluded that the only way to resolve the international, local, and metropolitan tensions was to evacuate Palestine, evacuation pure and simple. In the critical cabinet meeting, Bevin re-emphasized that Palestine was a heavy drain on British resources and was creating a dangerous spirit of anti-Semitism in Britain. He believed that the date for the withdrawal of British administration and British forces should be announced as soon as possible. Only by imposing a definite time limit would there be of any hope of forcing the Arabs and Jews to make arrangements for their own political future, as had been proved in the analogous case of India. The Indian solution thus played a prominent part in the decision and was duly applied to Palestine with the similar bloody results, only on a smaller scale. After September 1947, the influence of the British diminished. They stayed on, of course, for some 8 months until the expiration of the mandate at midnight, May 14-15, 1948. When the Union Jack was hauled down for the last time in Jerusalem, there were memorable episodes, such as the singing of Auld Lang Syne, as well as God Save the King. But the termination of the mandate from Ernest Bevin's point of view was only part of the story. The paramount aim was to remain on good terms with the Arabs as well as the Americans. The British could not do so as long as Palestine continued to poison the atmosphere. Arab nationalism, frustrated in Palestine, could not be appeased. It was the American failure, in Bevin's eyes, to curb militant Zionism that was at the heart of the trouble. Now, before the historic vote by the United Nations in favor of partition on November 9, 1947, Ernest Bevin wrote a letter in which he expressed the belief that the Jewish state would eventually become communist. Partition, I'm quoting, partition would suit them, the Russians, as a principle. Stalin would have no compunction at all in exploiting these nationalities to achieve his object by means of a whole series of states which Russia could control. On another occasion, Bevin used the phrase international Jewry with the connotation of conspiracy as an explanation of what had gone wrong. He believed that the Jews might be fitting into Stalin's plan for eventually absorbing Jewish Palestine into a system of Soviet satellites. Bevin's ideas on this subject were not idiosyncratic. Bevin's apprehensions about the Jews and communism can, of course, be traced back to the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Stereotyped ideas, as absurd as they may seem in retrospect, helped to explain Bevin's attitude towards the Zionists in 1947-48. Later, during the 1948 war, Czechoslovakia supplied arms and ammunition to the Jews. At the time, British intelligence reports indicated that refugees from Eastern Europe included indoctrinated communists. Thus, Bevin's attitude and his suspicions, though misguided in retrospect, are at least comprehensible. Bevin tried to influence other territorial outcomes of the struggle on two occasions. In early 1948, he encouraged King Abdullah of Jordan to take over most of Arab Palestine. He said, "It seems the obvious thing to do," and then repeated to Abdullah, "It seems the obvious thing to do, but do not go and invade the areas allotted to the Jews under the United Nations Partition plan." His plan, in other words, consisted of reducing the Jewish part of Palestine to a rump state, which would at least be acceptable, he hoped, to the Arabs. Again, an understandable hope, but also, once again, a miscalculation of the Arab response. On the eve of the Arab-Israeli War, 1948-49, no one, including Bevin, anticipated the extent of the Arab collapse and the Israeli victory. The British associated themselves with the Arab cause as one that was ultimately compatible with their own sense of purpose and mission in the Middle East. During the course of the war, Bevin became convinced that a grave injustice was being perpetrated because of American support of the Israelis. The Americans were responsible, in other words, for the creation, in Bevin's phrase, of a gangster state headed by an unscrupulous set of leaders. Bevin had to recognize that the Israeli had held frontiers that they had the military capacity to defend. He believed that the United States would refuse to rein in militant Zionism, but he could not neglect the overriding importance of retaining American goodwill. The only way to prevent Israel from establishing its own frontiers would be by British intervention, which the British Parliament and public would not tolerate. Bevin's exasperation can be summed up in his own words about the American attitude towards the new state, which developed over the course of the war in 1948-49. It's best summarized, perhaps, in his exclamation about the inept and misguided policy of the United States. I quote, "Let there be an Israel and to hell with the consequences." Bevin repeated, "Peace at any price and Jewish expansion, whatever the consequences." I would like to comment briefly on Bevin's attitude towards the commando or anti-terrorist squads and the case bringing the issue to a head. The case of Major Roy Faron, a brave and highly decorated soldier seconded to Palestine as a member of the SAS, Special Air Service, a deliberately misleading title to disguise the purpose of the unit, anti-terrorism, in which torture took place, and in Faron's case, murder. The point is important because it might reveal how far Bevin was prepared to go in combating the Zionist insurrection. It is important to note that the internal affairs of the Palestine Mandate were not Bevin's direct concern. It was the Colonial Office that was responsible for law and order in Palestine, but even there, a contradiction existed because the army in Palestine was not entirely under the full control of the Colonial Office or by the Sir Alan Cunningham, the High Commissioner. In 1946, General Bernard Montgomery himself had looked into the Palestine security forces and was appalled by the restraints. He believed that fire should be fought with fire, in this case, brutal methods if necessary, against the brutality of the terrorists. Thus, a special anti-terrorist unit was created under the jurisdiction of the army, to some extent the police, but allowed a certain secret freedom of action. Major Faron was directly involved in seizing a young Zionist, interrogating and torturing him, and then murdering him. Unfortunately for the British involved, the circumstances leaked out and it became a highly publicized case in the Palestine newspapers. The long and the short of the story is that Faron was court-martialed and then, in a procedure which many regarded as a travesty of British justice, was acquitted. The question is, how much did Ernest Bevin and Harold Bealey know of this? What was their reaction? Bearing in mind that they were not directly involved, but rather Sir Alan Cunningham and General Macmillan, the General Office commanding in Palestine. Nevertheless, the Foreign Office certainly knew about the alleged charges. Harold Bealey wrote, "Nothing could be more disastrous than our taking action which will give any grounds for the suspicion that the Palestine government or the British government were trying to steer the case in Major Faron's favor." Bevin's response was similar. It was unacceptable for the Palestine administration, for that matter the British government, to protect itself from embarrassment by interference with the letter of the law. This is not to say that Bevin would not have liked to take stronger measures to suppress terrorism or the militant Zionist forces, were it not for the sheer cost, the commitment to a huge number of British troops in Palestine, and the restraint of British public sentiment. He ultimately decided that it would not be worth it, among other reasons, but above all, to use his recurrent phrase, because of the lives of British Tommies. Now, at this point, I return to Richard Crossman's allegation that Bevin and Attlee plotted to destroy the Jews in Palestine and then encouraged the Arabs to murder the lot. Crossman actually used the word genocide. There is no evidence for any of this. It reflects on Crossman himself, his pleasure in stirring up controversy for the sake of controversy, shock for the sake of shock. Crossman was Britain's preeminent Zionist, but this episode reflects poorly on his character and judgment. The actual evidence of Bevin's anti-Jewish attitude is probably best summed up by the Assistant Undersecretary at the Foreign Office, who wrote in May 1948, the day or so after Israeli independence, I quote, "I must make a note about Ernest Bevin's anti-Semitism, which has come out increasingly sharply these past few weeks with the appalling crisis in Palestine. There is no doubt to my mind that Ernest Bevin detests Jews. He says they taught Hitler the technique of terror, and the Jews in Palestine were now paralleling the Nazis." Bevin uttered such thoughts when he was angry, but again, there is no evidence along the lines suggested by Richard Crossman. I do not myself believe that Bevin was an anti-Semite, though he said a lot of things that made others believe that he was. He was simply, or above all, an anti-Zionist. So how does one square the circle with Bevin as an anti-Zionist with the statesman who created the North Atlantic Alliance, who stands as one of the great foreign secretaries in British history, and who was actually beloved in the Foreign Office? Or Clement Attlee saying late in life that the man he missed most was Ernest Bevin, a man of integrity and principle. In the case of Palestine, I believe it helps to remember that the positions of Bevin and Weizmann, for example, were irreconcilable. It took time for both of them to realize that there could be no compromise, but they entirely understood each other. Bevin was totally committed to maintaining as much friendship with the Arab states as possible, and he believed Palestine to be the barrier achieving Arab goodwill. This was probably a misjudgment because the Arabs rejected each proposal put to them, but it helps to explain his frustration and anger. Weizmann, Ben Gurion, and others knew that Bevin would attempt to keep the Jewish state as small as possible. Thus, his agreement with King Abdullah that Jordan should invade Palestine and occupy all areas that were not heavily populated by Jews. It was clear that Bevin would go as far as possible to keep Israel reduced to a rump state in a small territory along the shore of the Mediterranean to make the creation of the state of Israel as acceptable as possible to the Arabs. Weizmann believed in the spring and summer of 1948 that Bevin had descended from being anti-Jewish to becoming an anti-Semite. Bevin himself believed that the new state of Israel was ruled, I quote again, by anti-British gangsters calling themselves Israelis. These are judgments at the time that are now engraved in history. At least we now have the historical perspective to try at least to understand them. And on the British side, there is a dual interpretation. For Ernest Bevin, it was certainly a defeat, but for the British Zionists, it was a monumental victory, not least for Balfour's niece, Baffy, who lived until the very day of Israeli independence. Thank you.